The swinging doors of a Wild West saloon were never designed for dramatic entrances. They weren't a stage prop for a hero in a white hat to announce his arrival to a room full of hushed gamblers. That is the sanitized, perfumed version of history they sold you in the 1950s to make the conquest of the West look like a moral crusade. In reality, those bat-wing doors were a desperate necessity of fluid dynamics and biological survival. They were there for ventilation. Because once you crossed that threshold, the air was no longer a resource. It was a biohazard. It was a thick, stagnant suspension of ammonia, unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the sweet, cloying scent of internal rot. The saloon was not a social club. It was a high-density infection vector. It was a terminal where the frontier's desperate labor force went to liquidate their wages in exchange for a chemical override of their miserable reality. It was the only place in town that stayed open 24 hours a day, not because of the community spirit, but because the biological machine of the frontier requires a pressure valve. And that valve was always, inevitably, coated in a thick layer of filth. The first thing you have to understand about the 1870s saloon is that it wasn't a building. It was an extraction point. In the early days of a mining camp or a railroad town, the saloon was the first organism to sprout from the mud. It didn't start with mahogany bars and crystal chandeliers. It started as a tent saloon, a canvas sheet stretched over a frame of scrap wood, sitting directly on the alkaline dust. So if the town survived the first 6 months, the tent became a soddy, a structure built of earth and grass, literally a hole in the ground where men huddled together to drink in the dark. Only when the capital became stable did the false fronts go up. Those grand 2-story facades you see in movies, they were architectural lies. Behind those tall wooden walls was usually a cramped 1-story shack. It was a visual audit designed to trick the brain into believing there was stability where there was only chaos. It was a corporate mask worn by a shack to project an image of permanence in a world made of dust. The floor beneath your boots wasn't polished oak. It was rough-hewn pine, or more often, just packed dirt covered in a thick layer of sawdust. This wasn't for aesthetic charm. The sawdust was a visceral biofilter. Its job was to absorb the constant discharge of the human machine. Spilled beer, vomit, blood from a broken nose, and the incessant rhythmic stream of tobacco spit. By the end of a Saturday night, that floor was a damp, fermenting slurry of everything the human body rejects. You weren't standing in a bar. You were standing on a massive, porous sponge saturated with the pathogens of 1,000 unwashed men. This was the primordial mud of the frontier, a breeding ground for bacteria that thrived in the dark, damp heat of the room. If you ordered a whiskey in a frontier saloon, you weren't buying a drink. You were participating in a chemical assault. True, aged bourbon was a rare luxury, shipped in small quantities for the rail barons and the high-stakes gamblers who could afford the markup. For the man in the mud, the option was rotgut, coffin varnish, or tarantula juice. And those names weren't metaphors. They were clinical descriptions of the product's effect on the human nervous system and the gastrointestinal lining. The economics of the trail didn't allow for the transport of heavy glass bottles of premium spirits across 1,000 miles of desert. Instead, the saloon keeper would buy raw, industrial-grade grain alcohol, essentially 190-proof fire, and cut it on site. To make it look like whiskey, they added burnt sugar or molasses for color. To give it the kick of aged spirits, they added a plug of chewing tobacco for a nicotine hit that spiked the heart rate. But it went deeper into the visceral dark. To simulate the burn of high-quality liquor, they added red pepper, To make it more potent for a population that was already chemically dependent, they added turpentine, ammonia, and creosote, the same toxic chemical used to preserve railroad ties. In some cases, they added strychnine in microdoses. Strychnine, in small amounts, acts as a violent stimulant. It sharpens the senses and creates an intense, artificial high, followed by a crushing, agonizing withdrawal. This was the liquid fire that fueled the frontier. It was a neurotoxic cocktail designed to bypass the brain's survival instincts and replace them with a singular, desperate craving. When you drank it, your internal organs didn't just process it, they revolted against it. It was a liquid override for a nervous system that had been ground down by 16 hours of labor. You didn't drink for the notes of caramel. You drank for the chemical blackout that allowed you to forget the mud for a few hours. The saloon was a miracle of microbial efficiency. In a world before antibiotics, before germ theory was common knowledge on the plains, the interior of a crowded bar was a high-speed highway for contagion. Think about the logistics of the unwashed. A man on the frontier might bathe once a month, if the weather was warm enough to break the ice on the creek. He carried those pathogens, lice, staph, tuberculosis, directly into the closed, smoky environment of the saloon. The most lethal part of the experience was the communal glass. Saloons didn't have running water. They didn't have sanitizing cycles. A glass was cleaned by a quick dip in a bucket of stagnant river water behind the bar. Water that had already been used to rinse 100 other glasses that day. Every sip you took was a biological exchange with every man who had stood at that bar before you. This was the true Wild West violence. Cholera didn't need a six-shooter to clear a room. Smallpox didn't need a holster. Tuberculosis thrived in the kerosene smoke and the heavy dampness of the sawdust floors. In the 1870s, you had a 50% higher chance of being liquidated by a pathogen you inhaled over a hand of poker than you did of being shot in the street. The saloon was a massive wooden petri dish, and every patron was a fresh culture for the next epidemic. It was a site of biological mathematics, where the density of the crowd was directly proportional to the speed of the next outbreak. We like to think of the saloon as a lawless free-for-all, but it was actually a highly structured environment, governed by a rigid ledger of exclusion. It was the frontier office, the central hub for the white male labor force, but the boundaries were carved in stone. It was a place for the white machine to reinforce its own biological hierarchy. A respectable woman wouldn't even walk on the same side of the street as a saloon. The air inside was considered morally and physically toxic. The only women allowed were the laborers, the saloon girls, whose job was to audit the pockets of the men. They weren't there for romance. They were there for resource extraction. They used the promise of companionship to keep the rotgut flowing and ensuring that the workers' wages were recycled back into the saloon's treasury as quickly as possible. It was a high-stakes psychological game of survival. And then there were the racial lines. The frontier was a melting pot, but the saloon was a filter. Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and black cowboys, who made up a huge portion of the labor force, were often barred by unwritten laws of biological hierarchy. They were forced to build their own shacks on the outskirts of town, peripheral saloons where the filth was even deeper and the liquor was even more lethal. The Main Street Saloon was a sanctuary for the dominant machine, a place where they could reinforce their standing while their livers slowly dissolved in a bath of turpentine and sugar. Forget the bar brawl. The idea of 20 men throwing chairs and crashing through tables is a cinematic fantasy. In reality, a saloon brawl was a catastrophic loss of property that no saloon keeper would tolerate. If you broke a mirror or a chair, You were paying for it with your life or your wages. The cookie or the bartender was an enforcer of the market's assets. The violence in a real saloon was quick, quiet, and mechanical. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a sudden, visceral extraction. It happened over a marked card, a spilled drink, or a perceived audit of a man's honor. The saloon was the ultimate mirror of the frontier's soul. It wasn't a place of legends. It was a place of desperation. It was a site where the human machine went to recharge its batteries with poison and pathogens. We have sanitized it because the truth is too oily, too gritty, and too dark to put on a postcard. We've turned the rotgut into craft bourbon and the sawdust into rustic decor. We've removed the smell of the ammonia and the sound of the tubercular cough. We've turned a biological disaster zone into a theme park. We have replaced the primordial reality of survival with the comfort of nostalgia. But the real frontier doesn't care about your nostalgia. It only cares about the math. The saloon was the ledger where the price of the West was calculated in gallons of toxic spirit and years of lost life. It was a machine for turning men into waste, one drink at a time. And the floor was always ready for the next layer of sawdust to cover the evidence. The cattle drive of the 1870s was not a journey of self-discovery or a pursuit of freedom. It was a massive, mobile extraction of value, an industrial-scale transfer of biological capital from the grasslands of Texas to the railheads of Kansas. When you see 3,000 head of longhorns stretching across the horizon, you aren't looking at nature. You are looking at a 3 million pound protein processing plant on the move. And the men tasked with driving that mass? They weren't the romantic icons of your childhood stories. They were biological gears in a high-friction machine, disposable components that were expected to grind themselves into the dirt to keep the capital moving. A cowboy in the late 19th century was a high-attrition, high-performance biological engine. This was a human being subjected to 14 hours of constant kinetic shock in a saddle, breathing the pulverized lung tissue of thousands of animals, and existing in a state of permanent sleep deprivation. To keep this engine from seizing up, the frontier didn't offer a menu. It offered a cold, mathematical administration of protein, lipids, and neurochemical stimulants. In 1866, Charles Goodnight looked at the vast, empty expanse of the Panhandle and realized that you cannot move capital across a desert without a mobile maintenance station. He took a surplus army wagon, reinforced the steel axles, and built the chuck box. This wasn't a kitchen. It was the logistical brain of the drive. Every tool, every gram of flour, and every drop of medicine was audited for its caloric utility. The man in charge of this hub, the cookie, was the most powerful biological gatekeeper on the trail. He wasn't a chef. He was an engineer of human output. He was usually a man whose own body had been broken by the trail, and he understood that his only job was to prevent a systemic hardware failure among the crew. He didn't care about the presentation of the plate. He cared about the total energy load of the crew. He was the only man who could tell the trail boss to go to hell, because he held the keys to the only thing that mattered: the fuel supply. The first requirement for a 4 a.m. start in a world without light is the artificial override of the human circadian rhythm. On the trail, exhaustion was a liability that the market couldn't afford. To bypass the brain's biological demand for rest, the frontier utilized a chemical weapon, Arbuckle's Ariosa. This wasn't brewed for its notes or its aroma. It was an industrial extraction process. The beans were coated in a glaze of egg white and sugar to seal in the oils, preventing the loss of potency during transport. The cowboys ground these beans by hand in a mill bolted to the side of the wagon. a rhythmic, mechanical labor that began before the sun. They threw the grounds into a pot of alkaline river water and boiled it until it achieved the viscosity of crude oil. They called it six-shooter coffee. The legend was that if you dropped a lewd bullet into the pot and it sank, the coffee wasn't ready. You needed it thick enough to float a horseshoe. This wasn't a beverage, it was a neurological whip. The massive dose of caffeine was the only thing keeping the prefrontal cortex firing when the body had been in the saddle for 18 hours. You drank it hot enough to blister your throat, not because you enjoyed the heat, but because the physical pain was the only thing reminding you that you were still conscious. It was a liquid override for a nervous system on the brink of collapse. On the Great Plains, there is no grocery store, and yeast does not come in a packet. To provide the necessary carbohydrate chassis for the day's labor, every chuckwagon carried a sourdough starter, a living, volatile colony of bacteria kept in a wooden keg. This was the mother. It was a fermenting mass of flour and water that captured wild yeast from the air. The cookie treated this keg with a reverence that bordered on the religious. During the lethal frosts of the High Plains nights, the cook would sleep with the keg inside his own bedroll. He wasn't being sentimental. He was keeping the bacteria alive. If the starter froze, the supply of pre-digested grain died. And if the bread died, the crew's biological battery followed shortly after. The sourdough was a biological hack. The fermentation process broke down the complex starches of the flour before it ever hit the cowboy's stomach, making the glucose available for immediate absorption into the bloodstream. They would take this fermented dough, drop it into a Dutch oven filled with boiling lard, and produce biscuits with the density of a lead sinker. It was a slow-release caloric brick. It sat in the gut for 8 hours, leaking energy into the system to prevent the hypoglycemic crashes that lead to a rider losing control of his mount during a midnight stampede. This was the fuel that powered the muscle, a constant, steady burn of grain and fat. Beef was the commodity, but it was also the fuel. However, you didn't kill a prime $5 per head steer just to feed a trail hand. That would be a catastrophic loss of profit. You ate the slippage, the animals that broke their legs in a prairie dog hole, or the calves born on the move that couldn't maintain the pace of the herd. When a calf was slaughtered, the Frontier's zero-waste policy went into effect. They called the result "son of a bitch stew," and it was a visceral map of the animal's internal anatomy. They didn't just use the muscle. Muscle was the least nutrient-dense part of the animal. They harvested the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and the marrow gut. The marrow gut was the secret to the biology of the trail. It was the upper part of the small intestine of a suckling calf, still filled with the digestive enzymes. When boiled, it released a rich, creamy, iron-scented sauce. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a nutritional necessity. Cowboys, living on a diet of dry grain and salt-cured meat, were perpetually on the verge of systemic inflammation. The offal, the organs, provided the vitamin A, the B12, and the essential fatty acids. The stew was a thick, gray, steaming slurry of biological essentials. It tasted of iron, bile, and fat. It was the taste of the Frontier's brutal efficiency. You swallowed it fast, letting the visceral fats lubricate a body that was being ground into dust by the trail. The final factor in the cowboy's biological equation was the electrolyte balance. A man sweating under a 100-degree sun in a wool shirt loses 5 to 7 liters of fluid a day. Along with that fluid, he loses the salt and potassium required to keep his heart beating in a regular rhythm. To To compensate, every piece of protein was aggressively salt-cured. Salt pork, salt beef, and salt-heavy lard. Every meal was a massive infusion of sodium designed to force the body to retain water, preventing the systemic dehydration that turns a man's blood into sludge. To balance this, they carried Arbuckle's peppermints, a rare burst of pure sucrose and glucose used for a quick hit of energy during the final, exhausting hours of the day. And then, there was the seasoning that no one asked for, the dust. The trail wasn't a road. It was a 1,000-mile cloud of pulverized limestone, dried manure, and mineral grit. It was in the air, it was in the water, and it was in the stew. You felt it between your teeth with every bite. This wasn't just an annoyance, it was a constant mineral load. You were literally eating the geography you were trying to conquer. The alkaline dust settled in the lungs and the stomach, neutralizing acids and changing the very chemistry of the body. We look at the Chuckwagon through the lens of nostalgia. We see a rustic outdoor kitchen. I see a high-efficiency mobile maintenance station designed to keep a disposable labor force moving toward a market. The cookie didn't care about the cowboy's palate. He didn't care about his health. He cared about the output. If the crew's biological battery died, the cattle stopped moving. If the cattle stopped moving, the capital didn't grow. In the 1870s, the market was the only thing with a soul. The men were just the biological transport system, a collection of meat and bone used to move a more valuable collection of meat and bone across a wasteland. We've sanitized this history. We've turned it into barbecue and Western-themed restaurants. We've removed the bitterness of the boiled acid, the smell of the raw offal, and the grit of the alkaline dust. But the real frontier doesn't have a menu. It only has a ledger. And on the trail, you either provided enough energy to move the herd, or you were left in the dirt to be reclaimed by the minerals. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think.